Ah, those halcyon days of painting the monster. Having the paint wear off, chasing it around from room to room for 5 minutes, catching up to it just in time to watch it take off, and then spend another 5 minutes trying to find it again. Maybe Monster Hunter is better off without it. After all, why delay the part of the game everyone is there for? Anything between you and fighting the monster is just wasting time. But is this really true? Let's discuss the history of tracking monsters, its place in the series, and the reasons for its changes. Firstly, I must address a problem with the previous video. It was stated that bugs are not little guys, and it has been brought to my attention by many that this is in fact incorrect. I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate lapse in judgment. Celtis has been notified of his corrected placement and delivered a compensation package of $5 million US. Thank you. Let's first define what tracking actually is so we're all on the same page. Classically, tracking is the gameplay mechanic in which you find the monster on the map and then keep track of its location as it moves around during the hunt through some means. Tracking was an integral part of the Monster Hunter formula right from the beginning. For the vast majority of the series' lifespan, tracking was done via paintballs. These could be crafted or collected from the box at the start of a quest. Upon throwing one at a monster, it would mark it with a dot on the map, and would remain painted for several minutes before wearing off and requiring you to repaint it. The only notable change that ever came to this system was in Monster Hunter 2, when they added the Dragon Watch balloon that you could sometimes see hovering in the sky. Using the wave emote toward it would cause the monster on the map to get marked for a short time. This system had its strengths and weaknesses, and I don't think it stayed the same for so long because it was perfect or for lack of better ideas. I really think it was a if it's not broken, don't fix it situation. The original concept of Monster Hunter was to be an immersive hunting simulation. Part of that gameplay was to find and keep track of the monster manually. Paintballs were a simple and effective way to accomplish this. I laid out a hyperbolic scenario at the beginning of the video, but those situations did happen at times. Anyone who's played first or second gen games knows how much Rathalos likes to change zones, and there's no worse feeling in those games than losing the paint on them. It can get really quite dire sometimes. Other criticisms you could make include the fact that it wasn't a very engaging mechanic. Paintballs were easy to come by, so it's not like you were ever in shortage of them and had to use them wisely. It was essentially just an upkeep mechanic that you had to remember to throw one every few minutes so the paint didn't drop off. You can argue it would have been better if it was something you had to carefully manage and actively engage with, but ultimately it was just a minor chore. On the other hand, paintballing played very well into one of old-gen Monster Hunter's most prominent aspects of skill expression: game knowledge. The old Monster Hunter games were, at their core, rather simple. Weapons didn't have many attacks, monsters didn't have very many abilities, the mobility of both you and the monsters were very restricted. The basic framework was layered with many supplementary mechanics and systems that added actual depth, such as tracking, crafting, gathering, and so forth. The greatest advantage you could get in these games was not really mechanical skill, but rather knowledge about the game in an informational sense. Knowing what monsters are weak to, understanding the way you deal damage, knowing where to gather and what to craft. Additionally, knowing the spawning and movement patterns of monsters. Indeed, tracking was actually an optional mechanic. When you get into the nuts and bolts of the game, monsters are very predictable. With the right knowledge, you can pretty much know exactly where a monster is, where it's going, and what it's going to do. There's only so many places it can spawn, and only so many zones it can go to. You can pretty easily play without paintballs at all once you know what you're doing. It's things like this that let you really flex your experience in the old games. So in this way, paintballs fit into the gameplay formula just right. When looking at the long arc of history through the series from a game design perspective, you can often trace a straight line through the games to see how various mechanics are incrementally changed and introduced over time. One of the few exceptions to this is tracking. Starting in Monster Hunter World, the way in which you track monsters was suddenly and dramatically changed. Paintballs were a thing of the past. Now you could search for tracks and other signs of monsters to follow their trail. For those who loved the immersive hunting simulation aspect, in many ways this was a win. However, it did have its own issues. Tracking down monster trails was only a thing at the start of the game. As you gained more research knowledge on a monster, the scout flies would increasingly aid you in leading you right to it, culminating in the monster being marked on the map right from the start. There's a lot to dissect about this. Monster Hunter World was many people's first experience with the series, and thus this was their only experience with monster tracking. and so from that perspective, I feel that it was generally well received. It's with series veterans that I believe it was more divisive. While the increase in immersion of searching for monster tracks could be a welcome change, the fact that the game eventually nullified the mechanic entirely for you could, on the other hand, be seen as a negative. And this is where we have to have an aside to talk about player agency. As I had said previously, tracking in the old games was optional. You could eventually learn to no longer have to rely on it. So it can be said that with World, they essentially baked that experience into the natural progression of the game. As you play, tracking becomes easier to the point where you no longer need to rely on it. This equalizes the experience among all players. Previously, only some players would put in the time to actually memorize monster patterns, while others would be left relying on paintballs forever. It could be said that having significant disparities in the player experience is a bad thing. To some players, though, being able to flex your knowledge of the game mechanics and do something better than someone else is something that adds enjoyment to the game. One of the most notable places that the tracking system in World went wrong from this perspective, then, is that it took away agency from the player. Whereas before, learning to rely less on paintballs was something you had to go out of your way to do, World just made it something that happens on its own by playing the game. You didn't have any say in the mechanic. Immediately after World, tracking was hit with another dramatic change. Probably the most dramatic change something can conceivably receive. It was no longer a mechanic at all. Starting with Rise, monsters were marked on the map right from the start. This wasn't entirely out of left field. It has more precedent than you might think. This is more suited to its own video, but to touch on it briefly, portable games, of which Rise is the most recent installment, are designed with a very different philosophy from the mainline console games. Being designed for portable handhelds and consoles, they have classically molded the Monster Hunter formula to fit a format that is easier to drop in and out of. If you only have a short amount of time to play, you should be able to make satisfactory progress in the game. For this reason, the portable games have always sought to get you into and out of the action faster. In some ways, Rise is the ultimate conclusion of this design philosophy. A game focused entirely on fighting the monsters that cuts out as much of the fluff as possible. To this end, the removal of tracking makes sense. As I said before, why waste any time getting to the part where you fight the monster? This was understandably divisive. For longtime veterans, this was an even further departure from tracking than World, and for players new to the series and World, the system they had just gotten used to, and may have liked, was immediately taken from them. Of course, if you had spent a lot of time in World, having all the monsters marked on the map from the start was what you were already used to, so it could be said Rise just moved that foregone conclusion to the start of the game. Coming into Wilds, I think many expected it to largely copy the tracking system from World. That is where it surprised us. Instead, it took after Rise and made tracking a thing of the past. Portable game design philosophy has always leaked into the mainline games little by little over time, but nowhere has its influence been so prominent as this. At least that's how it looks on the surface. I'm not so sure this was a case of intentionally converging design. Wilds changed the way hunting works entirely. No longer do you just post quests from an NPC. Now a majority of hunts are created via investigations on monsters that naturally spawn into the map. You can either save them to your quest list or just go out and start hunting them on your own. I think this created a potential design problem that was overcompensated for. Obviously, this was the new mechanic the devs wanted the player to interact with. If players had kept setting in camp posting the optional quests and never doing investigations or going out into the maps to hunt monsters, it would have been a failure. In order to create a system where the intended player experience was the one people actually had, they created a variety of incentives. One of which was having monsters that are currently spawned into the map be available to you either on the map itself or in a list that is easily checkable. This was the most generous way they could make sure players actually wanted to go out and hunt the monsters on the map. There are many ways the same thing could have been accomplished in less generous ways. They could have not let you post quests from camp at all, or had any optional quests. They could have shown you monsters spawned only in the map you're currently in, or perhaps showing what monsters are available but not their locations. What they ultimately ended up going with is design born of, I believe, paranoia. The way Wilds chose to conduct hunting is quite a shift from all previous games. Making the transition into it as smooth and frictionless as possible was a natural conclusion. Frictionless gameplay can be unsatisfying, though. A Mario game wouldn't be very interesting if you didn't have holes to fall into or enemies to contend with. Note that friction and difficulty are two very different things, though. That's not to say Wilds and Monster Hunter in general don't have plenty of friction elsewhere. I do think the lack of tracking is felt, though. It's almost contradictory to the rest of the game's design. Wilds does many things to harken back to older game concepts and tries to bring back some of the immersive hunting sim feelings to the forefront. It was acceptable and unsurprising to not have tracking in Rise, but losing tracking in a mainline console game that is very obviously trying to get back to the roots of the series leaves a bit of a sour feeling. So, where does Monster Hunter go from here? Is tracking gone forever? Like I said before, I don't think this is a case of converging design. I think Rise and Wilds had two different goals and ended up at the same conclusion independently. For that reason, I think tracking will make its return in a later game. At the same time, I could see a world where it stays gone. The Monster Hunter devs have made it abundantly clear that they do pay attention to feedback and talk about the game, and do make changes around what people ask for or don't like. I don't know if there's enough people actually clamoring for tracking to return. It would be easy to say that the removal of tracking has ultimately left hardly a ripple in the way the community talks about the games, and thus it's easier to just design the games without it, and probably there's more mass appeal in that option. For my own take on the topic of tracking, personally I always liked the old paintball system. I think overall World was a step down. I did a playthrough of World with Scout Flies modded out, and I enjoyed it quite a lot more. There's something about having to manually find and keep track of monsters yourself that really does just add a special touch to the gameplay of Monster Hunter for me. Playing through Wilds, I think I didn't really notice the lack of tracking much at first. The way it was implemented was very much to supplement the other mechanics, so its absence was not felt quite as much. However, having sat with the game more, and playing some of the older games again since Wilds came out, I do find myself missing it now. To me, tracking is a critical aspect of the Monster Hunter formula, and it's kind of worse without it. That's all from me for now. See ya.